Hey guys, Broken Stars here. I have some really good news. I've ran a bunch of pre-flop sims for Big Blind Defense that I'm going to make freely available to everyone um, on a Google Drive, which should be listed in the description. And today I'm just going to mostly be going over Big Blind Defense. So before I actually get into the sims, maybe it'd be helpful to think about Big Blind Defense just from a theoretical perspective. So if you think about big blind defense, it doesn't really matter where someone is RFIing from. If someone's open in position and it folds to you, the things that matter are the following. So big blind defense factors to think about. First, RFI range. Two would be like RFI sizing. And then three, probably rake. And then to a lesser extent, some other things to think about would be like population exploits. How often do they fold? Four bet, and then sizings. So specifically your three bet sizing, and then also stack depth. So how do these things change our strategy? Start with number one, just the RFI range. Say, here I'll do A. Wider RFI range equal wider defense. Should be pretty self-explanatory. So tighter RFI range equal tighter range, tighter defense. Pretty simple. RFI sizing. We should also say both calling and three betting should increase, and both calling and three betting should decrease in this situation. Then RFI sizing, figure sizing equal more folding and more three betting, and I'll try to explain why there's going to be more three betting versus the larger sizing. And this assumes that the RFI range is consistent. So for example, if you have a 40% RFI sizing from the button at 100 big blinds effective, keep everything the same, the big blind's going to be doing more three betting versus a larger RFI sizing than a smaller RFI sizing. This is just typical theory. Smaller sizing equal more calling, more defense. More folding, yeah, so this is fine. So less folding. So rake, higher rake equal probably more folding and more three betting. No flop, no drop. Which just means if you three bet and then they fold, you don't pay rake. So there's more incentive to three bet in this situation when the rake's higher. Lower rake equal more calling, more defense. So just more calling in general in the lower rake environment. So now let's talk about the other stuff, which is a little bit different, I think. So population exploits. So let's talk about various situations. So you got how much do they fold? So higher fold percentage equals more polarized three betting. Lower fold three bet percentage is going to be more linear, just generally speaking. Let's see, less four betting equal more three betting. More passive post flop, probably going to be more calling. Defense. What else would we think about? Well, I guess the opposite of this is more aggressive post flop. Equal maybe slightly more folding. something like that would be my guess. Let's say like number 5. So what did I put for 5? Sizing. So sizings, specifically 3-bet sizing. I don't think 3-bet sizing is going to have a large effect on the range composition, but say small effect might be larger 3-bet sizing equals slightly more polarized. Small effect might be smaller 3-bet sizing equal more linear and lower frequency overall. Something like that, I think. But I don't think the effects are going to be super significant. Be talking about 3-bet sizing a little bit when I go into some of the charts. And stack depth, I think slightly tighter in general. More mixing maybe. Smaller 3-bet sizings. Something like this would be like our baseline. So the first thing, so now that we got all this is just kind of like our assumptions. The next thing I want to go over is how I created the ranges. So I used POEdge preflop solver. This is the POEdge preflop solver. Basically, you input stack depth, so like stack depth would go here, out of position money would go here, and type all this stuff in. We'll just load a tree actually. So let's do an under the gun 3x open. So here's like the tree I made. So in this example, I made it be a 3BB open, and I just used the RFI ranges that I'm going to be giving you guys. So 17.6%. So this is just pseudo equilibrium. These pre-flop ranges were from a Munkersim with like 500Z rake, which is like way lower than the 200Z rake from well, on Ignition, which is where I play, and it's gonna be like most of the focus that I'm gonna be doing in my videos. But the sizings that I inputted here are just 3BB, 12BB for 3-bet, 26BB for the 4-bet, and then all in. And then you have to input post-flop parameters. And I don't think the post-flop parameters matter that much, but just in case they might matter in the future for whatever reason, feel like I should state what they are. So for the single race pot scenario, I just put 75% on all streets and 3x raises. For the 3-bet scenario, just 2/3 pot, all spots with 3x raises, and then I also allow all in on every street. And then for the 4-bet pot, 30% sizings, 3x raises, and all in on every street. And I don't think those settings are going to matter that much, but making any of those values bigger basically makes the game tree massive. So my computer, I have 128 gigs of RAM, but these trees are like 80 to 100 gigs in size usually, depending on what subset I use. So basically, it gets these values, and then the RFI range, and then Big Blind can do, well, it mixes all actions with every hand to begin with, and then it's an iterative process over a specific number of flop subsets. So there's 1,755 flops, but solving over that many flops is ridiculous. So I think for these I used a 60 flop subset, so just for future instances, all of my pre-flop stuff is either going to be like 44, 47, or 60. So in the under the gun case, there's less hands, so I think I did a 60 flop subset. But basically, if we look at the data, um, so this is the RFI range, and then here's the big blind response. So everything in red would be the 3-bet, and everything in green is a call. And if it's mixed, it's presumably 0 EV. So Well, the other thing I should say is how, what accuracy did I solve to? And for most of these, I solved to less than 1 BB per 100 for the exploitability, which is, I think it's pretty accurate, but yeah, I don't think you would see wildly different changes with the ranges, unless like rake or sizings were changed. Um, and so basically, how would I interpret this? Well, I think anything with like 100% 3-bet frequency, probably just always 3-bet. Anything with 100% defense, always defend it, so either call or 3-bet. And then the things that are mixed, me personally, I would highly recommend people just fold them, unless you have a good reason to call. So let's look at, well, all right. And then the other thing I want to say is like some of these 2BB preflop ranges that I created, because they're a lot less accurate because, well, there's the flop subset thing, and then there's the fact that these are ran to, I mean, they're ran to a low exploitability, but like a lot of these hands are just like very, 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 very close to 0 EV because you're risking 1 BB to call, and I mean, you need 25% equity realization to like make your money back, which is going to be pretty thin edges. So like in the scenarios for these preflop ranges that I'm going to be making available where you're facing the 2BB open, be a little bit careful. Like I wouldn't recommend calling 5-3 off or 8-6 off for some under the gun open. I'd be quite a bit tighter. Um, and for example, if you look at like some of these button 2BB, like they just don't look right. And I don't think it's quite an issue with the solve as much. It's just, well, this one doesn't look bad actually. This looks pretty reasonable. But it just ends up being like a lot of hands are like quite close. There's like 2.25. I think this one looks pretty good too. You see a little bit of weird stuff going on. Like why is 7 deuce called some, but like 9-4 suited isn't? It's probably a function of the preflop subset I ran it over, but again, there's like some inaccuracies with the just like with the solve because everything's really close and it's not a perfect game tree. And the game trees are like way bigger. So in the 2BB like open, like you're playing way more hands, and so the game tree is like just massively larger and it takes longer to solve. So they're just going to be lower accuracy. So this one was solved to 1.07, for example. So I'd be careful if you're looking at some of these data sets um, where where the RFI sizing is smaller. But I think for the most part, the 2.5 and 3BB open situations are quite good. So I'm just going to be talking about the probably 3BB open one. Um, so here's big blind versus 3BB open. I think for the most part, the defense range is like very solid. So I'd play pretty much identical to this. So I'd be defending, these 7x suiteds, all the king x, all the ace x, queen 6 I'd defend, suited 1 gappers, and then suited connectors for the most part, and ace 8 off. So I defend really close to this. Then the next area of interpretation is like, what should you be 3-betting? So, I mean, to a certain extent, I think that's a little bit harder to talk about. So I think the reason like the 3-bet size or 3-bet value is so high in this sim is because the rake that I'm including, um, which is 5% capped at 2 big blinds. So it says 200 chips, but I have the big blind being basically 100 chips, so two big blinds. And for ignition, that's 5% capped at $4. And I think the higher the rake is, the more you're going to have higher 3-bet percentage in equilibrium. So it's basically mixing, well, it's mixing everything. Kind of absurd, actually. Um, yeah. But I mean, if you look at the 3-bet range, or like how the button plays against the 3-bet, I mean, people probably play close to this, so seems reasonable. If PO thinks it's reasonable, it's probably reasonable. Now, how would I interpret this though? So here, let me, hmm, um, Yeah, let me close out of one thing. Let me open, can I open this? And then can I open, no. One second. All right, so if I were to interpret these results and kind of come up with my own plan here, I would probably just pure 3-bet everything it says to pure 3-bet. So it's like ace 10, king 10, ace queen, down to nines, I think. Stuff's mixed. Yeah, so like this range is just mostly just pure value, right? So all these hands are essentially, here, can I draw on this? I can't. Here, let me change my color. Do a blue pen. Yeah, blue pen looks fine. All these hands are basically pure. Oops, forgot nines. So I think just pure 3-betting this in your games is like solid. Now, for the other hands, which is mm, like these like ace X blockers, hands that are kind of whatever, like king 10, jack 10, queen 10, 8-5 suited, queen 6 suited. Like I don't know what this is, but I'm assuming it just has to do with how often, for the most part, the other guy is folding. And so for those hands, it would depend on basically how often your population is folding. Um, and then this scenario, what was the reaction? Oh, well, I have to close out of this to look. It was a 53% folding frequency. So we'll take a look at how often people are folding once they open for 3BB, but it's less than that, at least at my games. Um, so you know those like pure just kind of whatever hands that Pio is doing, I would not really recommend doing that. But like for the most part, this range I would just pure 3-bet. Now hands that have like a mix of value and playability and everything, it's like everything that's mixed. I just do things basically half the time and make my life pretty simple. So high card left, I'd 3-bet, and or maybe like for eights, if I had red card on the left, then I'd 3-bet. Um, and I'd do something like this. So yeah, this is like 12.75%. This is more reasonable and it's more viable in practice. And honestly, like even a lot of this stuff, kind of depends on who you're playing against or what your population is doing. Now I did end up, and what is this, 12.75%. And then what I did end up doing, before we look at what Pio is doing versus the various sizings, I also looked at what Poker Snowy is versus the 3BB Open, and I put it in here. This is only 11%. It's super ace-x heavy, and it's kind of looks a little weird, but the overall defense range is essentially identical. So here, I'll pull it up. So here is Poker Snowy's defense versus the 3BB Open, and as you can see, it's like pretty much identical. So ace 8x off, check, down to king 10 off, check for the overall defense, queen 10 off, jack 10 off, does the twos, what is this, 4 3 5 3, so 4 3 5 3, we do the defend, down to king 2, which one's this, queen 6, goes queen 6, then it does the 7x suiteds, I believe. Yes, and it defends 9-6 suited, so we're folding it here, but it looks like it's mixed. And there's going to be a lot of hands that are like really close to EV, but essentially the defense region is basically the same. So you just have to decide, should I 3-bet some of this garbage or not? I think it's mostly going to depend on your population, but I would just always 3-bet, this top end, which Pio is also doing. So basically like the 8s plus, king jack, queen jack, ace 10 plus, ace queen plus. So let me bring this back. Just gonna talk about something else. Let me put this like pure 3-bet range in again. Something like this. And then a lot of the hands that are close, maybe you want to mix. I'd mix these hands first, and then like I'd mix these hands first, and then if you want to add in some polarization stuff, then you just do some of this random stuff. And you get to like 12, 13%. And what I did is I actually went to, well, actually I don't want to talk about that yet. So before I go to that, we'll have this range. Here, let me save this range really quick. Just do test 2. So I can pull this back up. If we go back to the pre-flop solve, so we're defending, all this, but then there's these, close hands. If we look at the EVs, again, one big blind is 100 chips. So anything I would say, I don't know, within a tenth of a big blind, like plus or minus is like quite close. So for example, to put it in perspective, like 5-4 suited is 0.17 big blinds, 6-4 suited is 0.5. So if we pull here, actually I wonder if I can just pull up another PO. Maybe that would be easier. Well, let me take a picture of this actually, of the EVs. Make this smaller. It's fine. Pull up this range. So, oops. Yeah, whatever. Actually, let me move this to my other monitor. So if we just want to talk about what hands to defend, like 3-bet or 4-bet, doesn't really matter. Just down to something like this. These weren't defended. It looks something like this. Like this would be a good defense range versus 3BB. But a lot of these are really close. So what hands do you maybe want to consider folding? Or like, what ends up being close? And I would say close is like within a tenth of a big blind one way or the other. So like all these 9x hands, they're break even. So where's my, so like call is negative 0.1 big blinds, I believe, right? Yeah, yeah. Just doing this. These are all close. Basically break even. Ace 7 off, I guess, is kind of close. Ace 5 off is kind of close. Ace 4 off, it's with negative 0.95. Is there anything else here? No, not really. Let me scroll over. Let's look at some of these other hands. So like 9-6 suited, basically break even. 8-5 suited, basically break even. 7-4, 6-3, 5-2, 5-4. What 4-3s break even, 5-3s break even. 6-3, right? So 7, yes. These should be really close. And then you got these Queen X hands. Honestly, all the Jack X suited should be close too. Yeah. Negative 0.4, negative 0.1, negative 0.6. And I mean, this isn't perfect, but basically, if you were against weaker opposition or in a lower rake environment, these would be the first hands to make it in. So even these like 7 and 6, 8, 7, 9, 8, like they're kind of close. So I don't know, I guess 6-4 says it's kind of close. These one gappers or these weak one gappers are kind of close. So like if you wanted to um, essentially either fold a little bit more or call a little bit more, these would be the first hands to go into it. Would be these point ones. So that's kind of how I would interpret it. So the next thing I want to look at is the 2.5 dB RFI range. So same exact RFI frequency, but just for a smaller sizing. So 3-bet there was, I think it was 15.9, which is like absurdly high. If we look at a 2.5 range, 3-bet should go down, calling frequency should go up. And again, you see this like weird thing going on with like Jack 5. Like, I don't know what that is. Maybe it's a function of this flop subset, but I mean, the difference is like point. It's just really small. So I mean, these hands are all close, and that just goes back to the previous range that I was saying. So like a lot of the hands that were pure folds, now they're potentially mixes or calls. 3-bet frequency goes down, calling frequency goes up, and then versus 2x. Well, let's do 2.5x, 2.25, sorry. 3-bet frequency goes down again, calling frequency goes up. You get something like this. And here I'll show this EVs for this sim in case you want to pause it and look at the EVs. And then the 2x. So 3-bet frequency goes down, calling frequency goes up. So yeah, something like this. And my recommendation would be, if you don't feel comfortable calling something, probably don't call it. And then the hands that are mixed for 3-bets, it depends how often your population's folding. If they're folding a bit over 50%, it's probably good. It's probably fine. If they're folding less than 50%, probably don't include them. So for example, for the 2x situation and going 2 to 10, buttons folding 55% with an 11% 3-bet or 4-bet. Let's look at the 2.5. So I think most people open 2.5 or 3x. And so if it goes 2.5 to 11, buttons 4-betting 13.5, folding 57%. And then the 3x, and the super wide range, buttons folding 53%, 4-betting 14%. So if they're 4-betting, 12+% and folding, or like if their if their 4-bet is like higher, 3-bet less. If their 4-bet is lower, potentially 3-bet more. If they're calling or their folding frequency, mind you, is lower, 3-bet less of this mixed crap. And if the folding frequency is higher, like equal to or higher, then it's probably pretty reasonable. But if they're folding less than 50%, then probably don't really do it too much unless their folding frequencies post-flop are high, which, I mean, you're going to need more data for that. So that brings me to what do I do? And I actually went into my hold'em manager. I have all my hands. I can pull out the data, the aggregate data, and then export it to a macro file in Excel and kind of see what my average ranges are. I did this like quite a while ago. And versus button open, my versus any sizing, this is my presumed average 3-bet frequency, and this isn't perfect because I mean there's like some error in here somehow, but more or less this is close to what my 3-bet frequency is in the big blind facing a button open, and it's about 12.5%, which is pretty reasonable. I think if it's like less than 10%, you're for sure leaking, and if it's like, well, as we see, I think having it pretty high it could be okay. Um, yeah, and I mean this is versus any sizing, and some of the theory stuff doesn't necessarily apply to my games, so that would be like the next thing I would talk about. So well, maybe I'll make a different video about that. I'm not sure yet. But if we just go to my ranges here, this should be in the description. So I have free content here. This includes all these ranges. If you click on pre-flop ranges, you get some of the RFIs or facing 3-bets or whatnot. And I just added all of these solved to big blind defense ranges. So here's a folder, solve preflop ranges for BB defense pictures. And then if you click on this, click on 41.5, here's a picture of like the RFI. And then facing a different sizing. So if we click on 3BB, and it also says what this is. So this is 3BB, 3BB open, 12BB 3-bet, 26 4-bet, all in. Ran to 0.2 exploitability, 5% rake, capped at 2BB. So all that stuff is relevant, and 3-bet is 15.9%. So yeah. One thing I want to look at is our assumptions. So just to reiterate, so you get all the pictures here. There was one more thing. Oh, right. Okay. So I added the text files as well. So you can export this into your ranges folder for POSolver, or I think you can do it with GTO Plus, but I'm not sure. But these text files can be copied into your solver and you can use them yourself. But again, I wouldn't use them just how they are because presumably they're not very close to reality. So I would change them and kind of simplify them. But they can be good to reference at the very least. Just be careful if you're using them for solves because they might not really represent reality. But I wanted to take a look at our assumptions here that we started with and put some data into Excel. So hold on. Okay, so I put some of the pre-flop solved data into the spreadsheet, and we can kind of go over at least a couple of these things. So I just inputted the frequencies for the big blind facing these different RFI percentages and then RFI open sizings. So let's start with the RFI range. So I said for the RFI range, wide RFI range means wider defense, both calling and 3-betting. So if we go down, well, let's just start here. So as we go down this, it looks like folding frequency decreases, 3-bet frequency increases, calling frequency increases. Same for this sizing, same here. Wait, this is weird. Yeah, so I think for the 2BBB, the preflop solves are a bit less accurate, so this is why we see this not changing that much. It's because a lot of hands end up being really close, so probably not pay that much attention to this column, just because those solves are less accurate. So RFI sizing, we made an assumption, bigger sizing equals more folding and more 3-betting. So folding frequency should increase here. So 56, 71, 76, 82. We make the assumption that 3-bet frequency should increase. So 4.9, 5.5, 6.1, 6.8. If we look at the button scenario, yeah, folding frequency is kind of scuffed. And I don't know why this is. It's just inaccuracies with the solve, I guess. Unless I ran this sim without rake, which I might have, because this is like an older sim. But 55% fold, 56 to the 2.5, 68 to the 3BB, and then again the 3-bet frequency should increase. So 11.5, 13, 14, 15.9. Higher rake equals more folding and more 3-betting. So I only have one different rake setting that I solved for, and I don't have it in that spreadsheet. But for example, if we take this 3BB, this is 5% capped at 2BB, and then I have a tree 5BB. It's like the same thing except for capped at 0.2BB, so literally 10 times less rake. Well, actually, I think I only did it for I think I only did it for 2.5 big blind open. So let me compare those two. Here's the 2.5 big blind open with the 5% rake capped at 2 big blinds. 57% fold, 14.28 3-bet. And if we look at the lower rake one, which is this 3-bet's a little bit. Oh, here we go. Okay, I think this was capped at. Yeah, I put 20 chips in accident, so it's capped at 0.2 BBs. Basically, no rake. 3-bet frequency goes down. Folding frequency also goes down, and it goes down by quite a bit. So this is essentially very close to a zero rake environment. So a lot of hands end up becoming zero EV, and some just get added to pure calls. So that assumption is correct. And we can look at population exploits. So yeah, that one's a little bit more. I gotta do some digging to clarify that one. But here's sizings. So I ran a bunch of sims for big blind 3-bets, and I accidentally did it for like basically no rake. So I ran all of this. How many are even in here? 17. So 17 different 3-bet sizings. And let's just look at, some of the average. So here's 2.5 to 10. 3-bet frequency is 12.6. And let's look at 2.5 to 15. 3-bet frequency is 12.1. Not big change. And let's look at 2.5 to 7. So pretty small 3-bet sizing. 3-bet frequency is 11. And this is a little bit more linear. You see less of this random stuff. Like, yeah. Look at, but it's not a huge difference. Compare these again. The range composition for the 3-bet. See this bigger sizing, you see a little bit more polarization. So that's not as big of a difference, I don't think. And then I don't have anything for stack depth. I don't have any data to support these assumptions. Yeah. Population exploits. So I might have something for this. One second. Alright guys, I just spent like about an hour and a half getting in some population data from 200Z from Ignition to basically answer this question. So a higher fold to 3-bet, you just want to 3-bet more and polarize more, and I got some other data for that, but okay, so I have a ton of population data to go over. All this stuff at the top is, well, it's old studying I did like a long time ago, but all this data, well, actually all this data I just added. So basically I put down just the values from the POSIMs that I'm going to make available. So for the 2x open, the 2.5x open, and the 3x open, this again specifically for the button RFI, and how often the population is calling, 3-betting, and folding for these. And then this data is from PO, so this is just for reference. And then I also separated the data from all the dates that I have, and then also from 2020 onwards. Most of the data I have is from 2018. That's when I put in a lot of volume. And I don't have as many hands from 2020 onwards, but it's more recent. And then also include the button fold, the 3-bet, the button call, and the button 4-bet. And then here's some sample size. So the first thing I did was basically look at how often people are RFIing for different sizings. So on Ignition at 200Z, over all of the dates, about 20% of people are opening the button. Well, I shouldn't say of people. About 20% of the hands that I have, there's an RFI for 2x, 28% for 2.5, 40% for 3x, and 7% for 3.5. And this accounts for 96% of all sizings. So 4% of other sizings would be, other sizings basically. And then if I filter for 2020 onwards, there's a little bit less of 2xing, a lot more 2.5xing, a little bit less 3xing, and a little bit less 3.5xing. And I think that's just because the games are just a little bit more reggy than they used to be, and 2.5's caught on. There's more pre-flop solver, or not pre-flop solver, pre-flop, what do I want to call it? Like bet sizing programs. So you can just click a button, it's a little bit easier. So, but yeah, basically about 3/4 of hands are either 2.5x or 3x. Okay. Now the other thing I wanted to look at is, well, let's start with how the big blind responds. So the population versus 2x open, the big blind calls about 45%, 3 bets about 10%. Although they're folding a little bit more, it's actually not a massive mistake because this is a high rake environment. And let me load this pre-flop tree. Can look at the EVs again really quick. Just a lot of the hands that end up defending are like basically 0 EV. Like a lot of the, I guess it's not that close to 0. I'm not sure how much of this would account for. Like these King X offs, Queen F5 offs, like these 5x hands, these really weak suited hands, they're only like a tenth of the big blind or less, which I guess is relevant, but it's not that big of a deal, in my opinion anyway. Um, so the population actually does like kind of well, I would say. And then versus 2.5x open, they defend pretty well. They just under 3 bet. So the population's, calling 35% of the time, 3 betting 9.5% of the time. There's not much change between, my previous data and today. So big blind's holding 55.6, 55.4. It's really not that much change. And then again, all of my dates for 3x open, they're calling 30%. So PO is only calling 15%. And it's 3 betting, they're 3 betting 8%, PO is 3 betting almost 16% in the sim that I ran, which is like absurdly high, but at the very least it should be like 12 plus. And they're calling too much versus the 3x. And then I don't have a sim versus 3.5x, but out of these three things, the population, well, I should go back to the, you know, more recent data. So they're folding a little bit more than they used to. Again, this, I think it's just regs are better at defending now, and the population is just a little bit more reggish than it used to be. But the 3 bet is, I mean, it's still low. It goes down. So the population's 3 bet literally goes down as you size up, whereas we were saying it should go up. So me personally, I open 3x on the button mainly because of this reason. You just go post flop way more often. Like you don't have to fold as much um, to 3 bets. Like you just go post flop, you get to realize your equity way more often. But the main thing I wanted to talk about, which is basically how to play out of the big blind, right? So the button, when it opens 2x out of all these dates, folds to a 3 bet 56% of the time, which is, Pia's doing that, folding 55, 56%, very solid. But versus the 3x open, the population's average fold to 3 bet is 46%, and then in 2020 onwards, it's 43.5%. Make sure this all adds up to 100. 100, 100, yeah, 43.5% from 2020 onwards. And then when people open for 3.5x, I mean, I have small samples for this, but yeah, I mean, they're also not folding very much. And the 4 bet percentages are also really low. So for all dates and then recent dates, what does this suggest? It basically suggests that people are bifurcating their ranges based on their RFI sizing, um, which I mean I can prove. But what I'm saying is, let's say people, well, here, where's my button RFI? Let's say people are opening something like this, right? When they open for a 3x sizing, they're more likely to be opening the top portion of the range than the bottom portion. And then conversely, when they open for the smaller sizing, they're more likely to be opening for the bottom portion of this range rather than the top portion. And this results in them folding to 3-bets a lot more versus the smaller sizing. And they also 4-bet less. So the min open, they're only 4-betting 7% of the time. 6.5 for all dates, 7.3 for like the dates that I have normally. And then versus the 3x open, and the 2.5x open, oops, they're 3-betting 10.5%. And then how does that compare to PO sim? So PO is 4-betting, 13, 14% for a 2.5 and a 3x. And then folding, way, way, way less. So how should this result in us changing our ranges if we wanted to exploit the population? Well, we would do the opposite of theory. And the opposite of theory would be we would 3-bet more versus the smaller sizings because people tend to overfold and under 4-bet. And then we'd probably be more linear with versus the 3x opens rather than doing this absurd 16% 3-bet. So, and it's kind of funny because the population exploits itself or exploits each other. I'm not really sure how to word it, but basically the population's 3-bet percentages go down versus the larger sizings, and it ends up kind of being correct. I mean, it's still too low, but kind of ends up being correct because they just don't fold um, or as much. So with those weaker hands, that might be mixed 3-bets starts to make sense now. And yeah, I think I ran Sims a long time ago with population stuff. Here we go. So here's versus the average population 3BB RFI range, which is, oops, which is this. I mean, these are all partial frequencies that are normalized. Not really going to explain how I did this, but basically what happens is, yeah, you just 3-bet this top half. You're definitely not 3-betting 16%, but you're mostly defending the same range. I think ace-8 off was like the bottom, right? And the king x suited. So like this is tighter than theory would suggest and way less 3-betting. And this is just versus the RFI. It's not versus the how they react to the 3-bet range. I think this is it. Yeah, and this is filtered for them calling and 4-betting, I think. Yeah, this I node locked their call fold in 3-bet range versus the raise. And it doesn't change that much, but you can see it's just way more top heavy. Like really top heavy actually. And then if we look at the 2BB open situation, which is this range, and I mean you can literally see it's like bifurcated, so you're like there's more weak stuff compared to the top heavy stuff, and you 3-bet a bit more. Like defense range is mostly the same, but like you just 3-bet more. And this is again only with the RFI range. It doesn't take into account the like other node lock stuff. And then I think I ran one for 2.5, which is similar to the 2x. So this is their range on average, and then this is how we 3-bet. We 3-bet, a little bit more than the 3x range. And why do we do that? It's because they're weaker. They just don't get 4-bet as much. And I don't know if I ran. Oh, I did. What does this say? Node locked, RFI, call 3-bet, 4-bet, and fold the 3-bet. Oh wait, no, that's the wrong one. This is the 3x. There we go. 2.5x. Okay, so yeah, versus the people that are 2.5xing, if I node lock their fold the 3-bet and their 4-bet and their call, so what is this? 55%, 34% call, 10% 3-bet. I mean, I did these like a long time ago, but if we just pull up this data I just did, 2.5x, 2020 onwards, 35% call, 55% fold to 3 bet, 10% 4 bet. I mean, it's basically the same. So what does this mean? It means you could probably go as crazy as you want versus the 2.5x. I mean, I don't, I don't do this, but it just says, yeah, they're bifurcating their ranges and opening a little bit wider for the 2x and the 2.5x sizings as opposed to 3x sizings, which actually makes me want to bring up another thing. If I go to my population ranges here, what do I want to do? It's gonna take a minute to load. Do I not have raise for, no, I gotta go to position. We'll just go here. It's gonna take a second to load, so I'll just pause it. Alright, yeah, so what I wanted to say was just how you need to interpret data correctly to get like the right result. So for instance, my population's RFI range at 200Z is 36%, and if I filter for 2020 onwards, I don't think it changes very much. But if you think about an example where, let's say you have 5 people that are RFIing the button and you have one fish that's limps the button a lot, the average is going to be like 36%, but that doesn't mean that the average player, like the range that RFIs, is not equivalent. So what I mean is, let's say you have 5 people in a pool, 5 random people. They all open this except for a fish, and the fish opens, you know, he's only opening some stuff and then he limps a bunch of stuff. So maybe his RFI is like 10%. What is the average of those 5 players? Probably like 36%, which is how you get this value. And the only reason I bring this up is because I just saw this thread today. Hawkswin, who posts a lot on Run It Once, and he says a lot of good stuff. And this thread is about 3-bet sizing, and I guess I could talk about that as well. But he says he's 3-bet 10.6% of the time, seems too low, but my pool only opens button roughly 36% of the time, which is substantially lower than what a GTO sim would produce. And he's correct, because he's playing on Ignition, I'm pretty sure. Population is, if you just look at this data, only opening that much. But doesn't mean that that's the range that they opened with. So another example is like, these like ranges that I'm inputting, like for the button RFI, like this is the average range, right? But if I did the same sim and I just put 50% frequency for all this, as long as the ratios are the same, like this would end up saying it's a 25% RFI, or 20, half as much, 21%, 20%, but the resulting GTO response would be identical. So you just keep that in mind, because it's misleading a reg that's presumably quite good. And then with regards to 3-bet sizings, there's a post here. It says out of position should be different for small blind and big blind. Basically says big blind it's better to go larger, which is true, but the difference is quite low. So in all the sims that I did that I'm making available for like button versus big blind, I'm using more like sizings that are used, well, sizings that I use basically. So 2.5x open, I 3-bet to 11. I don't care if I'm in the big blind or the small blind, but at one point in time I did run a lot of sims for this, to see how out of positions EV would change, like usually using all these different 3-bet sizings and just keep increasing them up to 15. And I have a spreadsheet with that data. One second. Yeah, so here's just a bunch of data from the sims, and the sims were ran to pretty low exploitability, but I didn't include rank for these sims, which probably changes it. But you can see, let me see here. As I increased the 3-bet sizing, I kept out of positions pot odds versus the 4-bet the same. That's how I kind of decided what 4-bet sizing to use, but it's kind of arbitrary. I'm not sure what would be correct. Um, but the out of positions EV does increase as you increase the 3-bet sizing, um, but then you get diminishing returns. So like if you're only 3-betting to 7, it's quite low EV. I mean, there's like a 10% difference between these two things. Um, but once you're 3-betting at least 11, it doesn't really add that much. Doesn't really add that much EV. Um, yeah. So I mean, the what this guy says is correct. 3-betting for large sizing, in theory at least, would increase your EV, but I don't do that, and that's not the sizings that I utilize for these sims. Now, the other thing to keep in mind for all these sims is basically that. So, and the population data that I just showed. So, the population data, for example, this isn't filtered for sizings for 3-bets, 4-bets, doesn't filter for pre-flop stack depths or anything, but the trend is clear, um, and it's the opposite of what theory would suggest. So you just kind of have to be careful with how you create your ranges, basically. Um, I think following pre-flop charts and everything is going to be superb. Um, but if you have enough data to deviate accordingly, then you should do so. Um, and in this case, I do. I don't know what sites you guys are playing on, but yeah, um, yeah. And then another thing, so just more evidence that people bifurcate their ranges. The population's EV goes up quite a bit as the sizing increase, and the vast majority of your EV comes from top-heavy hands, and you see a huge staggering increase in the population's EV as they increase sizing. Um, it just makes it more abundantly obvious that the population bifurcates the range as a function of the sizing that they opt to use for preflop. Um, and that's it. So again, these ranges are available up here, and you can click on them and take a look. I would pay less attention to deeper into the game tree because you should be deviating more, and the data is a little bit less useful. So 4-bets, 5-bets, I would well, I would recommend that you look at your population stats rather than, or your success rates rather than just blindly 5-bet shoving ace 5 suited, which these ranges, are going to suggest out of position 5-bet. Oh, this is text files, but like pictures 2.5 out of position versus 4-bet. It's just going to be like shoving ace 5 suited, like pure. Would I recommend you do that in your games? I'm gonna go with probably not. And one of those big reasons is, their 4-bet percentages are significantly lower than they should be, which is another reason you could 3-bet more. But when they're only folding 43% when they open for a 3x sizing, you should probably just be pretty linear. So it's a 1-hour video. There's a lot of content here and available. And in the description, I should add the link to the Google Drive. Thank you and goodbye.